Well, thank you for joining us today. For 8 years, we had an administration that had a particular approach to judges that could best be described as the empathy standard. President Obama said on a number of occasions that he wanted judges who had empathy for parties. Well, the problem with that, if you're not the party for whom the judge has empathy, you're in for a pretty rough ride. This administration, the Trump administration, has taken the approach, the rather quaint approach, that the job of a judge is to try to interpret the law as it's written. Justice Scalia used to say, if you're not uncomfortable occasionally with the outcome you reach, you're not a very good judge. Justice Gorsuch put it this way. He said, judges don't wear red, they don't wear blue, they wear black. And so we are, this week, going to confirm 4 circuit judges. Chairman Grassley has done an extraordinary job of processing these judges and getting them out on the Senate calendar and therefore available for us to move forward. And that's what we intend to do beginning this week. We often hear our Democratic friends talking about the war on women. 3 of the 4 judges that will be before the Senate this week are women. We are going to lead off with Professor Amy Barrett at Notre Dame, who's the nominee for the 7th Circuit. Professor Barrett says faith is important to her. Her faith is important to her. She's spoken freely about it. She's allowed to do that in this country, by the way. But she also understands the role of a judge, which is to not let personal beliefs dictate how cases are decided. My colleagues on the Judiciary Committee are here today and will discuss Professor Barrett's nomination and how Democrats raised concerns about her religious faith during her hearings. And with that, let me turn to our chairman, Chuck Grassley.
Thank you, Leader. Our country has benefited from leaders from a variety of religious faiths. Our political leaders don't have to abandon their religious faith to hold public office. Article 6 of the Constitution, quote, no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. Professor Barrett is a brilliant legal scholar who has earned the respect of colleagues and students from across the political spectrum. She's also a committed Roman Catholic and has spoken passionately about the role that her faith plays in her life. This isn't inconsistent with being a federal judge. At our hearing, some of the comments and questions from my Democratic colleagues crossed the line. We even heard a question about whether Professor Barrett considers herself an quote-unquote Orthodox Catholic. She was also told that, quote-unquote, the dogma lives loudly within her. These remarks were entirely inappropriate. At the beginning of the hearing, I gave Professor Barrett the chance to clarify the meaning of an article that she co-wrote as a law student 20 years ago, which outside groups have misinterpreted. I wanted to allow her to set the record straight. Here's what she said, quote, if there is ever a conflict between judges' personal conviction and that the judge's duty under the rule of law, it is never, ever permissible for that judge to follow their personal convictions in the decisions of a case rather than what the law requires, end of quote. That should be the end of this matter. But my Democrat colleagues insisted on engaging in ugly anti-Catholic rhetoric. I want to express my sincere hope that my colleagues' behaviors won't discourage religious Americans from seeking public office and committing to public service. You will see tomorrow that Professor Barrett will be confirmed as the newest judge on the 7th Circuit. Congressman Young, Senator Young.
Well, thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Leader. It's good to be with members, my colleagues on the Judiciary Committee for this important press conference. We're joined today by three groups that I'd like to quickly introduce. Penny Young Nance, representing Concerned Women for America. Thank you for being here, Penny. Joshua McCaig, representing the Catholic Bar Association. Thank you, sir. And Professor Mark Rienzi, representing the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty. Thank you all. As a U.S. Senator for Indiana, it's a distinct honor to speak in support of Amy Coney Barrett, a fellow Hoosier who has been nominated by this president to serve on the U.S. Circuit of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. Professor Barrett's credentials are well known, a mother of 7 children, a distinguished legal scholar at Notre Dame Law School. She's clerk for Justice Antonin Scalia. Impeccable jurisprudential and legal credentials. Unfortunately, some of my colleagues on the left have made an issue not of Professor Barrett's legal qualifications, but instead of her Catholic faith. I'll echo what Leader McConnell has said. We do not have religious tests for office in the United States of America. Period. It's frankly concerning we're even having this conversation. I applaud everyone who's spoken up in defense of religious freedom throughout this process, including Notre Dame's president, Reverend John Jenkins, who expressed deep concern with the line of questioning one of my colleagues pursued with Professor Barrett in her hearing before the Judiciary Committee. Reverend Jenkins put into words what I believe many of us were thinking when this colleague of ours said that dogma in Professor Barrett, and that's of concern. He wrote, quote, "It is chilling to hear from a United States Senator that this might now disqualify someone from service as a federal judge," unquote. Dogma, he says, quote, "lived loudly in the hearts of those who founded our nation as one where citizens could practice their faith freely and without apology," unquote. I happen to agree with Reverend Jenkins that the attempt to live faith while upholding the law should command respect, not evoke concern. I take the Senate's role of appointing quality candidates to the federal courts very seriously. I also take very seriously our responsibility to safeguard religious freedom. And so my vote for Professor Barrett's confirmation will be both a vote for an outstanding nominee and a vote for religious freedom. I now turn it over to Penny Young Nance. Penny?
Thank you. Thank you, Senator, and thank you, Senator McConnell, Senator Grassley. Thank you so much for including me. Let me also say thank you to all the other senators standing here today in support of Professor Amy Coney Barrett. In standing for her, you stand for women of faith who are routinely mocked and derided for our beliefs. As the CEO and president of Concerned Women for America, the largest public policy organization for women in the nation, I'm honored to support Professor Barrett as a more than qualified candidate for the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. In fact, no one's really questioned her qualifications because she is a standout professional and academic. However, I was disappointed to see in her confirmation hearing the inappropriate questioning of her faith. And by the way, we saw this also with Russell Vought's confirmation OMB. It is a concerning trend. The Christian dogma that a few find appalling embodies the best of humanity. It calls us to love others as we do ourselves, to speak for those who can't speak for themselves, to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, attend to the widow and the orphan, and to care for those in prison. It teaches us to be truthful, honorable, and content. It teaches us to respect governmental authority, and yes, it teaches judges to be impartial and to love justice. These character traits should be celebrated in any judicial nominee, religious or not. For any senator who chooses to vote against Professor Barrett based on her religious beliefs, I would suggest that you can do that, but it says more about you than it says about her. Democrats should support Professor Barrett and confirm her with their most sincere apologies. And I'm grateful to be here. Thank you.
Mr. McCray.
Thank you, Senators, for this opportunity to be here today. My name is Joshua McCaig, and I represent the Catholic Bar Association as its president. This is a national organization of Catholic legal professionals. When the Catholic Bar Association was established, there was concern among the founding members about growing intolerance to Catholic professionals serving in public office. Sadly, our fears were confirmed during the recent Senate confirmation hearing of Notre Dame law professor Amy Barrett. Despite a distinguished legal and academic career, certain members of the Senate Judiciary Committee launched an unfair attack to discredit Professor Barrett because of her Catholic faith. While I watched this confirmation hearing, my heart sank. Before my eyes flashed a vision of a nation in which the ruling elite, through an arbitrary and subjective standard, may dictate the degree to which it is acceptable for a person of faith to be religious and still be qualified for public office. I saw a country in which my children who are being raised Catholic may be disqualified from participating in the civic life of their beloved nation for being faithful to that religious tradition. Is this a vision of a vibrant, free United States of America that respects the rich and diverse religious pluralism of its citizens? Sadly, it is not. The attack on Professor Barrett was not just an inappropriate and likely unconstitutional personal attack against her and her Catholic faith, but also an attack against any person of faith who takes his or her convictions seriously and aspires to serve the people of this great country. So we ask the Senate to take a stand and to make clear that all citizens, regardless of their faith background or lack thereof, are to be judged on their professional qualifications to serve, not on their religious affiliations. Thank you.
Thank you, Senators. The Constitution forbids the government from imposing religious tests. Under our Constitution, we are all free to serve, to be evaluated on our own individual merits rather than on our religious beliefs. That rule goes for Catholics and for Jews and for atheists and for Muslims and for everyone else. Professor Barrett happens to be Catholic, but the principle is much, much broader. When some said that Democratic Congressman Keith Ellison, who is Muslim, should not be permitted to take his oath of office on a Koran, we at Beckett said that was wrong and a violation of the No Religious Tests Clause. Religious tests were wrong and unconstitutional then. They are wrong and unconstitutional now. The arguments and suggestions made today against a highly qualified Catholic nominee that her religious beliefs are somehow incompatible with government service could be used against people of any faith. They are terrible echoes of tired and bigoted arguments that for centuries supported religious tests in England. And those were anti-Catholic, anti-Presbyterian, anti-Quaker, anti-Methodist, anti-Jewish, anti-atheist religious tests. In this country, similar arguments and religious tests were used for years to keep Jews and atheists from serving under state and colonial laws. Our Constitution rightly puts those arguments in the dustbin of history, so that here everyone is free to serve and no one is excluded because of her religious beliefs. Whatever your views on religion, we should all reject any effort to impose religious tests for public office anymore. That's what the Constitution demands, and it is also the right thing to do. We are all better off when everyone is free to serve. Thank you.
Majority Leader McConnell, thank you for teeing up these important judicial nominations this week. The outcome of these votes is not in doubt. That's thanks to former Majority Leader Harry Reid, who, because of his abuse of the Senate rules, created a mechanism whereby 51 senators can vote to confirm these nominees, and so they will be confirmed by the end of this week. And we think our Democratic colleagues understand that, which is why they have so desperately reached for any excuse not to vote to confirm well-qualified people like Amy Barrett for the Circuit Court of Appeals. But we know that this is one of the main reasons why President Trump was elected over Hillary Clinton in the first place, because of the importance of these nominees and the service of these judges from the Supreme Court down to the Court of Appeals, down to the district courts. But unfortunately, we have seen a concerted effort to drag out the confirmation process, even among judges who ultimately get 70, 80 votes. And so there is no real effect on the outcome. It's only to burn more time on the Senate calendar and to prevent this president the opportunity to have his team serving in his administration. And that includes judges as well. But we're determined not to stand for that. And that's why we are here standing together to say these 4 judges will be confirmed by the end of this week. And there are many more that will be voted out of the Judiciary Committee over the coming weeks and months that will be confirmed to fill all of the vacancies on the federal court left for President Trump. Senator Hatch.
As former chairman of the Judiciary Committee and as chairman of the Finance Committee today, I have to say that we stoop pretty low if we start to raise questions of religious belief before somebody can serve on the federal judiciary. Now, I hope that that type of questioning will hit the dustbin of history where it belongs. Amy Barrett's a very qualified person. She should not be disqualified because she has a firm religious belief and lives it. I think it's pretty bad if we say to people who are really good people that because of your religious belief you cannot serve on the federal judiciary. And if we go down that route, then can you imagine all the other issues that can be raised about various people and how difficult it would be to pick federal judges? There's prejudice involved here. And it's hard for me to understand why some of my colleagues feel the way they do on these issues. I think a lot of this has been driven. People say, well, Roe versus Wade is now established. Well, it is. But it's hard for me to understand. It's not hard for me to understand why that particular case has created so much division in the law, because there was no justification whatsoever for deciding that case that way. But it's been decided. And all I can say is that that case shouldn't stop somebody from serving on the federal judiciary either way. And to make a long story short, Amy Barrett is a very highly qualified woman who has great experience, somebody we would want on the federal bench if we have any brains at all. And I really resent the application of a religious test because she's devout in her faith. You can be devout in your faith and still uphold the law, even sometimes when you disagree with the law, as a judge less than the Supreme Court. And on the Supreme Court, you need to uphold the law as well, under most circumstances. So I'm proud of my colleagues for being willing to stand up, and I think it's time that we get rid of this type of thinking and make sure that this type of thinking does not prevent qualified, outstanding people from serving on the federal judiciary, which is of benefit to all of us.
There was a time when anti-Catholic bigotry could regularly be heard in the halls of Congress. A time where former leaders of the Klan were treated as respected members of the Senate. A time where Blaine amendments were being adopted across the country explicitly as an effort to bar Catholics, to erect legal barriers to Catholics being accepted in our society. I think a great many of us had hoped we'd put those dark days behind us. That sorry chapter in our history had been relegated to the history books. And yet we are seeing a reemergence of that same hostility to faith and that same hostility to the Catholic Church. The previous administration persecuted the Little Sisters of the Poor in a way that was truly indefensible. And today, in this Senate, we have seen repeatedly nominees grilled not for their qualifications, not for their record, but for their faith. We saw Professor Barrett, a distinguished professor at Notre Dame, a respected academic, someone whose credentials are impeccable, grilled by Democratic senators, one Democratic senator demanding, "Are you an Orthodox Catholic?" With the obvious presumption being, if the answer were yes, you're not fit to serve on the federal bench. Another Democratic senator calling out, the dogma lives strongly in this one. It's almost as if we'd gone back decades in this institution's history. We saw another nominee being questioned by the runner-up for the Democratic presidential nominee. In this instance, the nominee is an evangelical Christian, and having his views about salvation. What does your faith teach about salvation? Those questions have no place in a Senate hearing. I recognize that today's Democratic Party is not the party of JFK anymore. Today's Democratic Party is much more secular, happily embraces atheists. But if the message of Democrats is Catholics need not apply, if the message of Democrats is evangelical Christians are unfit to serve in office, if the message of Democrats are it's okay if you serve so long as you are not, in the word of one Democratic senator, a, quote, Orthodox Catholic, then that is a sad, sad testament to where this body is. Now, I hope and believe we're not there. I hope and I want to believe that these are aberrations. But we have an opportunity. We're going to have 4 judicial nominees before the Senate this week. There's an opportunity for every Democrat voting to decide where he or she stands. Are you part of establishing an unconstitutional religious test contrary to Article 6 of the Constitution? Are you part of saying the Democratic Party does not welcome Orthodox Catholics? Or will you stand for religious liberty and religious faith? It is my hope that Professor Barrett will be confirmed 100-0. Based on what we've seen, I don't think that is likely, but I do think we're seeing a test. But it's not a test of the nominees, it is a test of the United States Senate.
179 years ago, this past Friday, we marked the 179th anniversary of an executive order issued by the governor of Missouri, Lilburn Boggs, who wrote that the Mormons must be driven from this state and, if necessary, exterminated. Interestingly enough, that executive order wasn't lifted until the 1970s. It remained a lasting testament to religious bigotry and the fact that it occurred, that it has its seeds in some of our history, but we can't let it repeat itself. This was something that the founder of the Mormon Church, Joseph Smith, decried against when he taught repeatedly that the civil magistrate should have the power to punish guilt, but never to suppress the freedom of the soul. It's one of the reasons why, as a lifelong member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I'm a firm believer in the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause and in the prohibition against any type of religious test in government. And this is not an issue that is shared only by Republicans. This is not a left versus right issue. As Christopher Eisengruber, the president of Princeton University, who himself, like Professor Barrett, served as a law clerk on the U.S. Supreme Court, only unlike Professor Barrett, he served as a law clerk to Justice Stevens. He said that the questions directed at Professor Barrett have no place in this setting, and they don't. Because the fact is, her religious beliefs, her religious affiliation, they have nothing to do with her qualifications to serve as a federal appellate court judge. And in some respects, the way they were asked was even worse than somebody just asking whether she was a Catholic.
In this setting, they weren't just asking, are you a Catholic? They were asking, do you actually believe that stuff? Do you actually believe the doctrine of your church? Do you believe it deeply, sincerely? Suggesting that if so, that was somehow a problem. This, too, is a problem. We cannot allow it to persist, and I look forward to confirming Professor Barrett to the Court of Appeals this week. Thank you.
Is one of the grand issues of our day that, amazingly enough, is unresolved. Can you have a faith in America and live it? Are we going to be a nation where you can have freedom of worship, where if you want to worship over in that place at that time and no one sees it, that's okay, but if you bring it out into the public square, that's a problem? That seems to be the primary issue of debate at this point. And that seems odd because our Constitution is very clear. We don't have freedom of worship. We have the free exercise of religion, meaning you can have a faith and live your faith and it not get in the way of both your public service or your public enterprise. As odd as it may seem, this, I thought, was an issue that was resolved in the 1960s when a president named JFK was running. When John Kennedy stood in front of a group of Protestant ministers in Houston, Texas, and said, if I run on this election and lose, I'll happily return to the Senate. But if I fail to be elected because of my faith, then 40 million Americans have lost their right to be able to be president the day they were baptized. The question that we're resolving this week, among many things dealing with judges, is again resolving this issue of the free exercise of religion. Do Americans need not apply to be judges, to be in public office, to be able to serve in the federal government if they have a faith and they live their faith? Or can we, as we have said for more than 200 years, you can have any faith, live your faith, or have no faith at all and still be a great American? I'm shocked that this is still a conversation in our nation, that we become a nation that's become afraid of people of faith. You can have a faith and you can have a name on your faith, just don't ever let anyone see it. That's not who we are. That's not who we should be. And I'm glad we're moving forward on Amy Barrett's nomination to be able to say, let's evaluate people based on their qualifications, not based on their private faith.
Well, I think we've heard about Amy Barrett. We've heard about her qualifications and who she is. We've heard wonderful things about her. I think of all the endorsements that she's had, the best one, the one that means the most to me, is the endorsement of all the clerks. You know, she was a clerk for Scalia, and all of them know what she does, and they know her well. So that was the right thing, and when this whole issue came up, I just think it's pretty outrageous. But I want to mention one thing that happened last week you may have forgotten about. We had a guy named Scott Polk from our state of Oklahoma. He was one who was actually nominated not by President Trump, but by President Obama. And he ended up with getting 79 votes out of 100 votes. So you know he was qualified, but they still had to go through 30 hours to show. Now, what's the reason for that? The reason is just to be obstructionist. So I hope that we're seeing now that this isn't going to work, and I'm looking forward to voting for Amy Barrett. She's going to be a great justice.
Anybody have any questions for Senator Grassley or anybody else up here on this topic?
I have a question about a different Catholic named Paul Manafort.
That's why I said this topic. Anybody have any questions on this topic?
For any of the senators up there, if you're saying you can't have a religious test to serve in office, how do you square that with your support for Roy Moore, who said a Muslim should not be able to serve in Congress strictly because of his faith?
I'll be glad to try to respond to that. I think just because you're a member of a political party doesn't mean you agree 100% with what some other office holder or candidate for office feels. So I would disagree with that statement. And I dare say that if you ask each one of the members up here what they would feel about that, they would say the same thing. Yes, ma'am.
Senator Cornyn, the former campaign chair, Paul Manafort, was indicted today,
and that really isn't our job. That's not our wheelhouse. That's the special. No, if you'll give me, if you all would just hold on just a second. The special counsel was appointed by the Department of Justice, and that is the person you need to be asking the questions of. That's not our responsibility.
My question is, do you think that this impedes the president's ability to do his job?
Well, I will tell you, as far as Congress doing our job, I believe that the investigations into the Russia active measures involving the election are continuing apace, both in the Judiciary Committee by Senate Chairman Grassley and the Ranking Member Feinstein, as well as the Senate Intelligence Committee. And I suggest I don't see how the indictment changes the president's ability to do his job. There is a process for this to go forward, and I trust that it will happen.
Some of your Republican colleagues have put forward bills that would prevent the president from interfering with Bob Mueller's investigation. Should Republican leaders put those bills to a vote in the event the president tries to interfere?
Well, since you all don't have any more questions on the subject of the
So she is a Notre Dame law professor, and she's being nominated to the Seventh Circuit, where the Notre Dame case against the birth control mandate is pending. Is there any conflict of interest there? Since she has a background, she is virulently against the birth control benefit and comes from that same university.
Well, there are rules in place to deal with conflicts of interest and recusal by judges under the appropriate circumstances. That ordinarily is left up to the judge to make the initial determination and subject to appellate review. So we'll have to leave it to that process. Any more questions about this topic?
Senator, are you concerned that the Manafort matter today will interfere with your ability to pass tax reform? Does it suck all the oxygen away from that effort at this point?
Short answer is no. Any more questions about the judicial nominations? Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Senator Erwin or Senator Feinstein's offices have not returned our questions for comment on what they've said. Do you fear that this could become the new normal for questions like this? And are there any repercussions for senators who question nominations?
Well, that's the reason we're here today, is to say this should not become the new normal, where people's deeply held faith is somehow disqualifies them for service in any position in government, including the federal judiciary. But I would suggest that really the questions ought to be directed toward the senators who seem to make that test, which, as we've all said here today, is unconstitutional.
Is any senator willing to take a question about Manafort? Senator Cruz?
I tell you what, why don't...
We'll have plenty of time for that.
Yeah, we'll have plenty of time for that, but since there are no more questions on this topic, we'll be glad to talk to you on a one-on-one basis and in the press conference.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.